Studying abroad is supposed to be the highlight of a young person's life. A new country, a new language, new friends, new food, new streets to get lost on. Every brochure, every Instagram post, every study abroad fair on a college campus sells the same dream. Freedom, adventure, and a fresh start somewhere far from home. But for a handful of real students, that dream turned into one of the most disturbing headlines of the decade. A quiet Italian hill town became the backdrop for a murder investigation that captivated the entire world for 8 straight years. 2 friends on a service trip vanished into a jungle and left behind evidence that still doesn't fully add up. And an ambitious young man on his way to a study abroad program made one impulsive decision on a 5-day detour that ended his life. Every detail in this video is documented. Court records, official investigations, and reporting from the journalists who covered these cases as they unfolded. Let's get into it. Story 1. The murder in Perugia is a small hill town in central Italy. The kind of place study abroad students dream about. Cobblestone streets, medieval architecture, a university that's drawn foreign students from all over the world for decades. In the fall of 2007, 2 young women arrived there within days of each other, both about to start their own version of that dream. Meredith Kercher was a 21-year-old exchange student from the University of Leeds in England. Spending her year abroad studying European politics and Italian at the University of Perugia. Classmates described her as caring, witty, and popular. The kind of student who threw herself completely into the experience. Her roommate, an American named Amanda Knox, was a 20-year-old University of Washington student who'd worked several part-time jobs back home just to afford her own year abroad. The 2 young women, along with 2 Italian roommates in their 20s, shared a 4-bedroom flat on a quiet street called Via della Pergola. By all accounts, the early weeks were exactly what a study abroad brochure promises. Kercher and Knox went to a chocolate festival together. They explored the city. Knox met a young Italian computer science student named Raffaele Solecito at a classical music concert in late October, and the 2 quickly became a couple. Then, on the morning of November 2nd, 2007, everything changed. Knox and Solecito returned to the apartment that morning after spending the night together and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The front door was open. There were drops of blood in the bathroom. A window in one of the other rooms had been broken. Kercher's bedroom door was locked and she wasn't answering. When police and a friend forced the door open, they found Meredith Kercher's body, partially covered, on the floor of her room. She had been sexually assaulted and had her throat slashed. What followed became one of the most heavily scrutinized criminal investigations in modern history. Italian police almost immediately focused their suspicion on Knox and Solecito. Despite conflicting physical evidence and a chaotic, contested investigation that forensic experts would later criticize for years. During overnight interrogation, without a lawyer present, Knox gave a statement implicating her boss at a local bar, a man named Patrick Lumumba, who was arrested and held for 2 weeks before a solid alibi cleared him completely. Knox later said the statement had been coerced during hours of aggressive questioning, in a language she was still learning, under conditions her family would go on to describe as psychologically abusive. The actual physical evidence at the scene told a different story than the one prosecutors initially pursued. Bloody fingerprints found in Kercher's room were matched to a man named Rudy Gede, a local man with a previous criminal record who had been at the house earlier that same evening, socializing with roommates downstairs. DNA evidence linked him directly and unambiguously to the crime. Inside Kercher's body, in bloody footprints leading away from the scene, Gede fled to Germany within days of the murder and was later extradited back to Italy, where he chose a fast-track trial and was ultimately convicted of Kercher's murder and sexual assault. But Italian prosecutors didn't stop pursuing Knox and Solicito. Despite the physical evidence pointing overwhelmingly toward Gede acting alone, prosecutors built a theory that all three had been involved in what they described as a drug-fueled sex game gone wrong. Knox, nicknamed Foxy Knoxy by the tabloid press, a nickname that had actually started as an innocuous childhood soccer nickname, became a global media sensation, portrayed alternately as an all-American girl wrongfully persecuted by an overzealous foreign justice system, or as a manipulative, cold-blooded killer, depending entirely on which country's newspaper you happen to be reading. What followed was an almost unbelievable legal odyssey. In December 2009, Knox and Solicito were convicted of murder. Knox received 26 years. In 2011, an appeals court overturned both convictions, citing serious flaws in the DNA evidence, and Knox was released after spending 4 years in an Italian prison, flying home to the United States the very next day. Then, in a stunning reversal in 2013, Italy's highest court threw out the acquittal entirely and ordered a full retrial. In 2014, an appeals court in Florence convicted them both again. Knox, now living safely back in America, was sentenced in absentia to over 28 years. Finally, in March of 2015, Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation issued its final, definitive ruling, fully and permanently exonerating both Knox and Solicito, citing what the court itself called stunning flaws in the original investigation. The case had, by that point, consumed nearly 8 years, 3 separate trials, and endless international headlines, all stemming from a single, brutal night in a quiet apartment that 2 students had moved into, expecting nothing more than the ordinary adventure of studying abroad. What makes the story linger, for anyone who studies it closely, isn't just the murder itself. It's how quickly an ordinary study abroad experience became a legal nightmare that swallowed years of multiple young people's lives. Kercher's, whose real story often got lost entirely behind the media circus surrounding her roommate. And Knox's, an exchange student who went from an unfamiliar apartment in a foreign country to an unfamiliar prison cell in that same country, based on evidence a court would eventually describe as fundamentally, catastrophically flawed. Story 2: The Trail That Swallowed Them. Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were lifelong best friends from Amersfoort in the Netherlands. 21 and 22 years old, one studying cultural studies, the other applied psychology, both dreaming of careers helping others. In March of 2014, they flew to Central America, together for what was meant to be the trip of a lifetime. Several weeks combining travel with volunteer work, teaching Spanish and working with local children in the mountain town of Boquete, Panama. They spent their first 2 weeks touring the country, meeting other young travelers, posting cheerful updates and photos to social media. On March 29th, they arrived in Phuket and moved in with a host family they'd be living with for the next month while they volunteered. Everything about the trip, up to that point, looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. On the morning of April 1st, 2014, with a few free days before their volunteer work officially began, Kris and Lisanne decided to hike a well-established local trail called El Pianista, a popular, well-marked route that typically took hikers about 5 to 6 hours round trip, ending at a scenic overlook above the surrounding cloud forest. They set out around 11 a.m., reportedly bringing along the host family's dog. They told people they'd be back for dinner. They never returned. By the next morning, they'd missed a scheduled appointment with a local guide. Concern grew quickly. On April 6th, their families flew to Panama, along with Dutch police and detectives, joining local authorities in an intensive 10-day search of the surrounding jungle. It turned up nothing. Weeks passed, the investigation stalled. Then, on June 14th, more than 10 weeks after they vanished, a local woman found Lisanne's blue backpack sitting out in the open along a riverbank many miles from the trail the two women had originally set out on. Inside were their passports, some cash, sunglasses, a water bottle, and most critically, both of their cell phones and Lisanne's digital camera. All still in surprisingly good condition, despite months of exposure to the jungle. What investigators found on those devices is the part of the story that still unsettles people who research it today. Phone records showed that in the hours and days immediately following their disappearance, the two women had made dozens of desperate attempts to call emergency services, both Panama's emergency line and the Dutch equivalent back home, using both phones repeatedly for days. Only one call out of dozens of attempts ever connected, and it cut off after just 2 seconds. The calls continued on and off for over a week. One of the phones was still being powered on and off as late as April 11th, 10 full days after they vanished, with someone repeatedly, unsuccessfully trying to enter the correct PIN code to unlock it. Then there was the camera. Buried among ordinary daytime hiking photos was a set of 90 flash photographs taken deep in the night, between the hours of roughly 1 and 4 in the morning, nearly a full week after the two women had disappeared. The images are dark, disorienting, and largely inexplicable. A stick with what looks like plastic bags tied around it, propped upright on a rock. A blurred shape that some investigators believe might be the back of one of the women's heads. What looks like a backpack strap or a mirror laid out deliberately on a rock beside a riverbank. Nobody has ever definitively explained what the photos show or why they were being taken or by whom. At that hour, in that location, days after the search for the two women had already begun. Roughly 2 months after the backpack was recovered, searchers combing the riverbank near where it had been found turned up a pelvis bone and a single boot, still containing a foot. Over the following weeks, at least 33 separate bones, scattered widely along the same stretch of river, were recovered and confirmed through DNA testing to belong to Kris and Lisanne. In total, investigators were only able to recover roughly 10% of Lisanne's skeleton and about 5% of Kris's. A forensic anthropologist who examined the remains under magnification later stated there were no scratches or marks of any kind on the bones. No evidence, in other words, of animal scavenging, which under normal circumstances would be expected on remains left exposed in dense jungle for that long. Dutch investigators and forensic pathologists who worked the case for years ultimately concluded that the most likely explanation was that the two women became lost or disoriented on the trail after dark, wandered off the marked path, and eventually fell from one of the many steep cliffs and ravines that surround that stretch of jungle. With the punishing seasonal flash floods common to the region, likely responsible for scattering their remains and belongings so widely along the riverbank over the following weeks. A book published years later by two Dutch authors who reviewed the full police file reached the same conclusion, describing it, somewhat reluctantly, as a tragic accident rather than anything more sinister. But the physical evidence left behind, the days of continued emergency calls, the strange, deliberate night photographs, the near complete absence of most of their remains, has never fully satisfied everyone who has studied the case, and Kris and Lisanne's disappearance remains, to this day, one of the most debated true missing persons cases of the last decade. Story 3. The 5-day detour Otto Warmbier was, by every account, exactly the kind of student every parent hopes to raise. He graduated as salutatorian of his high school class in Wyoming, Ohio, and went on to the University of Virginia, where he was pursuing a degree in commerce with an eye toward a career in finance. He was ambitious, high-achieving, and well-liked. And in the winter of 2015, at 21 years old, he was preparing to take part in a university-sponsored study abroad program that would take him through two of Asia's major financial centers, Hong Kong and Singapore. Before that program began, Warmbier decided to fit in a short detour. He booked a 5-day New Year's tour of North Korea through a budget travel company called Young Pioneer Tours, a company that has openly marketed itself, somewhat infamously, as offering trips to destinations your mother would rather you stayed away from. His father later said the company had advertised the trip specifically as safe for American citizens, and that Otto had simply been curious to see the country and meet its people firsthand. On December 29, 2015, Warmbier flew into North Korea with a small tour group of about 10 other Americans for what was meant to be a brief, tightly chaperoned New Year's holiday. On their final night in the country, the group had been out celebrating in Pyongyang, and some members continued drinking back at their hotel afterward. On January 2nd, 2016, as Warmbier was waiting at Pyongyang International Airport to fly out of the country and continue on to his actual study abroad program in Hong Kong, North Korean authorities pulled him aside and arrested him. The official accusation was that Warmbier had attempted to steal a large propaganda poster from a restricted staff-only floor of his hotel. 3 weeks later, North Korean state media announced publicly that they were holding an American student for what they called a hostile act against the state. In late February, Warmbier appeared in a state-produced video, tearfully confessing and begging for forgiveness. A confession that included claims almost every outside observer immediately flagged as implausible, including an assertion that a secretive university club back at UVA had promised him membership in exchange for stealing the poster. and that a local church back home had put him up to it. Legal experts and journalists who reviewed the case widely concluded the confession had almost certainly been written for him under duress. Multiple former North Korean detainees have described similar coerced confessions after their own releases. In March of 2016, following a one-hour trial with no meaningful legal defense, North Korea's highest court sentenced Otto Warmbier to 15 years of imprisonment with hard labor. And then, for the next 15 months, he simply disappeared from view entirely. North Korea refused consular visits from Sweden, the country that represents American interests inside North Korea in the absence of formal diplomatic relations. No outside official, no family member, nobody was allowed to see or speak with him. His family had no information at all about his condition, his location, or whether he was even still alive. In June of 2017, everything changed abruptly. American diplomats learned through an urgent meeting with North Korean officials in New York that Warmbier had actually been in a coma for more than a year. Reportedly, according to the explanation North Korea eventually offered, the result of contracting botulism sometime shortly after his trial and being given a sleeping pill from which he never woke up. Within days, a US delegation, including a medical team, flew into North Korea and evacuated him back to the United States. When Warmbier arrived home, doctors described his condition using an unsettling clinical term: unresponsive wakefulness. He was unable to speak, unable to see, and unable to respond to anyone around him in any way. His parents, seeing him for the first time in a year and a half, said he appeared to be in visible physical distress. Medical staff explained that the pattern of brain damage they were seeing was consistent with a prolonged severe loss of oxygen to the brain, the kind of injury typically caused by a cardiac event, not botulism, casting immediate and serious doubt on North Korea's official explanation. Just 6 days after arriving home, surrounded by his family, Otto Warmbier died. He was 22 years old. The full truth of exactly what happened to him during those 15 silent months has never been independently confirmed. In 2018, a US federal court found the North Korean government legally liable for what the court's default judgment described as his torture and death, after North Korea declined to contest the case in court at all. What's certain is this: a driven, high-achieving college student, days away from starting the legitimate study abroad program his university had actually organized for him, made one impulsive 5-day detour and never came home from it. 3 stories. 3 students who left home, chasing the same ordinary dream. A new country, a new experience, a chance to grow up a little faster than they would have back home. A murder investigation that trapped an innocent exchange student in a foreign legal system for years. 2 best friends who vanished on what should have been an easy afternoon hike, leaving behind evidence nobody has ever fully explained. And a promising young student whose 5-day detour turned into the worst decision of his life. None of these students did anything reckless by most people's standards. They didn't wander into obviously dangerous places or ignore obvious warnings. They did exactly what millions of students do every single year: traveled, explored, said yes to an adventure. For most of those millions, it goes exactly the way the brochure promises. For a small handful, it doesn't. And that gap between the two is what makes these stories so hard to shake. If this video got under your skin, hit subscribe. New true stories every week. And let me know in the comments which one of these 3 stories disturbed you the most. See you in the next one.